We need on-site renewable energy, high efficiency, and all-electric homes everywhere in order to have a safe, just transition.
There are going to be incredible opportunities for workers in this new energy economy.
That environmental justice is also about communities being able to take charge of their own infrastructure.
In 1898, Samuel Insull, a former assistant to Thomas Edison turned collaborator with financier J.P. Morgan, laid out a vision for America's electricity future in a speech to investors at the National Electric Association. The vision? The private monopoly ownership of U.S. electricity infrastructure with regulation by government-appointed committees. Westinghouse, with Nikola Tesla's innovation, the AC induction motor, had won the current wars. The development of AC electricity infrastructure to energize factories and bring homes across the country out of the dark age was a national priority, and the leading model for development was municipal electric utility ownership. The first municipal utility was established in 1880, and the benefits were clear. Public ownership of electric infrastructure would directly serve municipal residents, and the profits would be invested directly back to the community. Yet, the number of municipal electric utilities peaked in the early 1920s at 3,000 and fell to approximately 1,900 by 1930. The reason? A coordinated anti-municipalization campaign orchestrated by private companies, banks, and investors in service of expanding an investor-owned electricity system. The idea was simple. Create a regulatory system that protects private ownership of critical public infrastructure and guarantees investors a protected rate of return on every dollar invested. These investor-owned utilities, IOUs, now serve 3/4 of the electricity ratepayers in the United States. At the time, there was a compelling case to be made for protecting the return on private investment in new infrastructure. As a nation, we knew that electrification meant increased economic productivity. The scale of the effort was massive, requiring thousands of power plants and thousands of miles of transmission and distribution lines. The assets were expensive to build and would need to generate revenue over a long time horizon to pay back the initial investment. There wasn't enough public money available to meet the scale of the effort. By guaranteeing profits, large sums of private money flowed into IOUs, and the U.S. experienced a rapid build-out of the electricity system. The scale of the investment, the amount of profit to be gained, and the fundamental social importance of the electricity service we have placed into private ownership has made effective regulation a constant struggle. Throughout history, effective regulation and public policy intervention have been crucial to the continuation of the system. The electricity privilege we currently enjoy is a direct result of public policy intervention in response to disruptive innovation and economic catastrophe that has occurred over the last 100 years. One of the first major challenges to the new investor-owned system was the Great Depression. Dried-up investments exposed the inability of states to oversee the activities of large multi-state companies and demonstrated the limitations of investor-owned utilities providing electricity service outside of densely populated areas. This resulted in the passage of the Public Utility Holding Company Act that restricted utility company operations to a single state, the creation of the Federal Power Commission, now FERC, to oversee interstate electricity markets, and the New Deal on rural electrification, which formed the USDA Rural Utility Service, which continues to fund rural electric co-ops that provide electricity service to 3/4 of the nation's geography today. Over the past 100 years, public policy interventions have continued to support the utility system in times of crisis and disruption, including after the oil embargo and energy crisis of the 1970s, the introduction of competition through the formation of wholesale power markets aimed at controlling the spiraling costs of monopoly utility investments, the implementation of PURPA, which allows merchant power plants like hydro dams and wind farms to connect and sell power into the monopolized system through long-term contracts, again working to control costs through competition, state actions requiring energy efficiency and in-state renewable development, and many more. Over the last century, every reform has been aimed at tempering the central problem of private monopoly ownership of electricity infrastructure, that utility investors get paid a protected rate of return on investment on every dollar they invest in electricity infrastructure. The advantageous investment results in investor pressure to continually increase investments. The more they invest, the more return on investment they make. Without competition and effective regulation, this leads to overly expensive capital projects, think coal and nuclear plant cost overruns, and more projects than are needed, all of which need to be paid back by ratepayers. Since ratepayers are on the hook for repayment, efficiency and conservation are a threat to utility investors, putting utility investors, one of the richest and most influential lobbies in the country, directly at odds with their ratepayers and with state and national policy goals of keeping energy prices low. Today, this problem has reached its boiling point primarily due to three factors. The first is energy productivity. Until the 1980s, the more energy we used in the U.S., the more economically productive we were. These market conditions favored the IOU regulatory construct of protecting investor returns to ensure growing availability of money for new energy projects. That condition has changed, however, and we have become more productive per unit of energy. We have overbuilt our assets, many of which we are retiring early. Electricity prices continue to increase, and we have greater options for customer energy efficiency and conservation, which is not profitable to the system owners. Which brings us to our second factor, the growth of distributed energy resources. Our electricity system has operated under a simple parameter since its first days. Supply must equal demand, or failure occurs. It was and is, for the most part, a dumb system, with a few big machines generating electricity and sending it through thousands of miles of conductors to millions of small machines. Today, however, we fully possess the technological and financial know-how to better match supply and demand using DER's distributed energy resources. This DER optimized system can be more efficient, more resilient, more affordable, and more renewable. This requires, however, that the ratepayer have agency, becoming investors and owners in the electricity system. In the current system, turning captive ratepayers into active consumers and investors is again a threat to utility investor profits. This leads us to our third factor, corporate political power. With corporate spending enshrined as free speech, our electoral system is increasingly for sale to the highest bidder. Unfortunately for the energy system, the highest bidders have been utility investors, and they have clear incentives: maintain monopoly control, increase the amount of capital investments, and increase the return on the investments they make. The result is that utility investors be fully compensated with interest for coal and nuclear facilities that they retire early, that they own the new solar, wind, and storage assets that replace them, for which they will be compensated handsomely plus interest, and that ratepayers who will be responsible for paying the assets off through electricity rates be restricted from efficiency and DER investments that will threaten repayment. The result is the highest cost, least advantageous electricity system for U.S. homes and businesses. It's hard not to imagine where we would be if we had built our electricity system like our highway system. It sure seems like we would have a much clearer path if our system was publicly owned. We are trapped by our past decision making, and we are poised to further electrify our energy use, which will layer investments onto a system already at cross purposes. It begs the question, could we better align our social goals and the goals of utility investors? Could we, in a sense, all be rowing in the same direction? Or is the regulated monopoly system ultimately inadequate to address the challenges of the time and take best advantage of the opportunities presented by today's electricity system? With these questions in mind, we'll begin the conversation with Andrew Kell, policy analyst at Renew Wisconsin. We'll take a deep dive into utility regulation, and we'll discuss regulatory strategies that enable DERs and local clean energy development as central to the energy transition in the Midwest. I'll warn you now, we cover a lot of territory, so grab a coffee and get comfortable.
Hear from Andrew Kell and our other Season 4 guests at Rise Up Live events at the 2023 Energy Fair, June 23rd through the 25th in Custer, Wisconsin. Attend live events to ask questions and get involved in the conversation. Energy Fair early bird tickets are now on sale through May 15th at theenergyfair.org/tickets.
We are joined today by Andrew Kell, policy analyst at Renew Wisconsin. Andrew's had worked at the Public Service Commission for 10 years, working with renewable energy policy, wholesale markets, retail rate design. Before he was hired at Renew, now he works on policies that push renewable energy and EV infrastructure forward. He has a wide experience in policy areas related to renewable energy. And today, our goal is to dig in deep about electricity markets, how they work, how they're regulated. It's awesome to have you here, Andrew. How you doing today?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'm doing great today.
So I want to just jump right in here. There's a lot to talk about. What has you excited about the future of electricity markets in Wisconsin and the Midwest?
Yeah, I know we've been talking about the clean energy transition for quite a while, but we're starting to see major steps forward now happening. In the last few years, utilities have put forward major applications for solar and now solar and battery storage at the utility scale. We're seeing more and more installations of solar PV on customer rooftops, both commercial, residential, and industrial customers now as well. Electric vehicle policy is being talked about more and more. There's projections of higher penetrations in the coming years. I think the economics are going to improve there, and we're going to see a lot more electric vehicle adoption in Wisconsin in the next several years. And the clean energy transition is well underway.
Yeah, none of this exists in a vacuum, right? It all comes about because of technology innovation and policy and regulation. So maybe we'll just start here and talk specifically about Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is a regulated state, and in the U.S., we have a long-standing utility monopoly model where investors, private companies, own most of the electricity grid assets and serve most of U.S. electricity customers. So let's go back a little bit. What led to the privatization of utilities, and what are some of the positives and negatives of this kind of investor-owned utility model in your mind?
I mean, you go back 100 plus years when electrification was first happening. Really, the first drivers were for economies of scale. So dense urban environments, and that's where capital flowed, where there was a high density of number of customers and energy use, or load as we call it. You had groups of investors that formed private utilities. They were able to make those investments in distribution and generation, later transmission grids to tie all those cities together. And that was really the first step where private business, private capital was able to make those large infrastructure investments to electrify urban areas. And later, municipalization of smaller cities and towns took place, and there was starting to be, small cities and towns, suburbs, cities connected together in distribution grids. And later on in the 1930s, and the economic recovery and the Grand New Deal that took place helped federal funding for the electric cooperative investments to happen later on, so that rural areas could be electrified as well. And that's where the economies of scale just were not there at that time, and really preventing economic progress in rural areas for both agricultural land and other businesses that wanted to start up in rural communities. And so that was a great opportunity for the federal government to come in and support the cooperative development of electric utilities in the state of Wisconsin, as well as throughout the United States.
You just mentioned kind of the three types of utilities we think about when we think about who owns and manages electrical infrastructure: investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, and cooperative utilities. So let's maybe start with the big fish, the investor-owned utilities, and talk about utility regulation, and maybe we can just use Wisconsin as an example. So as you mentioned, been doing this for 100 years, and the process is relatively similar. So maybe we just talk about first, in this regulated state of Wisconsin, how are projects built? What is the process that is used for utilities, if they're regulated investor-owned utilities? How do they actually build things?
Yeah, so all the utilities in Wisconsin, and this includes investor-owned utilities as well as municipal utilities, are regulated by the Public Service Commission. They are the utility regulator, a state agency that is quasi-judicial. There are 3 commissioners appointed by the governor. They all have 6-year staggered terms, and they oversee all the what we call applications, utility applications for construction projects. And this could be very, very large distribution investments. It could be transmission investments, generation investments, and the utilities must put forward a case in which they show the economics are there. There's a definite need for an asset, that this particular asset serves that need, that there won't be any undue impact to local communities and environmental impacts as well. So the Public Service Commission goes through a very long list of criteria that must be met in order for a construction project to go forward, and it's incumbent upon the utility applicant, once again, to make their case before the Public Service Commission. A very legal proceeding occurs that allows other parties and citizens to weigh in and influence the Commission's decision. Commission staff also provide usually very objective, knowledgeable information with regards to state regulations and what's required, why the project is good or bad, pros and cons. And then there's a very long list of micro decisions essentially associated with the construction projects that allows for conditions to be put on the development of a large transmission line, for example, or a large new wind or solar facility that we're seeing now these days as well.
You have two parties there, right? You have the investor-owned utilities that are proposing projects and the Public Service Commission that is approving, modifying, rejecting. What are the motivations on both sides? What's the motivation? Why are the utilities, why do they want to build projects? And so what are their motivations and responsibilities? And what's the motivation and responsibility of the regulators, the Public Service Commission?
Right. So an investor-owned utility is, privately owned by shareholders. And so they have financial motives where they earn a return on their investment. It's called a return on equity, which the commission sets every time there's a new rate case before them for that particular utility. And they also, just as a business, they want to be able to sell their product and they want to be able to deliver reliable service to their customers as well. So there's a variety of just natural incentives for utilities to make those investments. We'll go through a long process in forecasting new load, how their customers' use is changing over time. Electrification of the transportation sector is going to be a really interesting trend as that continues to develop in the state of Wisconsin, and utilities working with the Public Service Commission with regards to how to accurately forecast the new load that will be coming from these electric vehicles. So they're making their case before the Public Service Commission that, again, whatever asset they're proposing is needed in their generation portfolio, for example, if it is a generation asset, and that this particular asset, again, among all the alternatives that may exist, serves that need the best, economically, efficiently, and with regards to environmental impact and impact to the community as it stands as well. Then you asked about the Public Service Commission, what's their influence, what's their desire, and in general, they want to provide reliable, cost-effective, low environmental impact energy to customers. And as their duty for overseeing the utilities, they want to make sure that the law is upheld, that any desire the legislators have written down in law is followed, that the utilities are following those rules, following those tariffs that are established in the rate cases, and all of the price signals that are being sent to the customers motivates the individual retail customers to have energy use behavior that, again, is cost effective for the economy and for the environmental impact that's associated with their energy use.
The more that utilities build, the more return on investment that their investors get. And as you mentioned, the Public Service Commission's job, or their motivation, is to keep electricity costs low, but make sure we have built enough assets to keep reliable electricity there. And the utilities have a monopoly over their customers, so their customers don't have choice. They'll be trapped into whatever decisions the Public Service Commission make. And the way that happens, that contract is called a tariff. So utility rates. So that's how the utilities then collect the money to pay back their investment. So the Public Service Commission sets those rates. How does that process work? What does the Public Service Commission do?
Yeah, just like we were talking about in a construction application, there's a similar legal proceeding that occurs for a rate increase. And there's certain criteria that must happen. For example, if a utility is going to, somewhat rarely ask for a rate decrease, there may be no official hearing required for that. But in general, if they're asking for a rate increase, if there's going to be an impact to retail customers, there must be a public hearing. There must be an official proceeding that allows parties to become what are called interveners in the case. They're official parties. They're allowed to have attorney representation, provide evidence, what we call testimony, written testimony before the Public Service Commission, the right to cross-examine utility and other party witnesses, and at the end of the day, put forward, like I said, evidence and legal briefs and input on the decision matrix, all those micro decisions that must occur before the Public Service Commission when an application is before them, whether it's a construction case or a rate case. And then that really tees up all of the documentation for the individual 3 commissioners to go through, which they're responsible for reading all of that evidence to make a decision in that rate case. So there's a process. For investor-owned utilities, they're usually on a cycle with regards to rate cases. So if they're not in for a full rate case, they're in for what's called a fuel case that particular year, in which all of their fuel costs, so this would be traditional fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, as well as market. If they're purchasing from the market, what are called locational marginal prices from MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, those wholesale prices are a pass-through to retail customers. So the commission and commission staff have to do the due diligence to make sure that all the fuel prices that were set in the recent rate case are still accurate. And if any true-ups need to occur, then there are fuel price adjustments that occur if there's not a full rate case. And if they're in the cycle in which a full rate case is required, then that usually begins in the spring, late spring, or early summer. Official proceeding takes place. Evidence is developed and put into the commission docket. And then ultimately a public hearing and a technical party hearing will occur sometime in the fall. And the commission will make a decision and issue an order sometime in December. And those new rates will become effective by January 1st of the new year.
Yeah, so you brought up wholesale rates, which I think is a good distinction, right? We're talking about retail rate making, so what the customer pays. So maybe let's unpackage that on a customer's utility bill. What is present in this rate? I mean, I think we're talking about the price per kilowatt hour as a rate, but there's other aspects. So what are the aspects of this tariff? Rate is one aspect, but what are the other things that go into that tariff negotiation?
For a residential customer, they have the most simple rate structure, or rate design, as we call it. And it's typically a fixed customer charge that is regardless of your energy use, when and how much you use your energy. You are charged $10, $15, $20 per month, for example, for electricity, and that's your fixed amount that you pay. Then there's the volumetric charge, which is the kilowatt hour charge, and that's dependent upon how much energy you use. So for example, between 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour for your kilowatt hour usage. And then there's taxes and fuel adjustments and other types of line items that may be listed on your bill as well. That could be, most oftentimes, are volumetric charges as well, applied to your kilowatt hour usage. And that will then, all be multiplied on a line item basis, and then you'll have a subtotal and total at the end of your bill that adds up to, let's say, $100 for that month for your energy use and service for using electricity from that electric utility.
The other aspect of that tariff also is kind of this net metering. Say you have a solar PV system. You want to talk about how that plays into like a typical tariff?
All utilities in Wisconsin have, municipal and investor-owned utilities have what's called a net metering tariff option for their customers that install, for example, solar photovoltaic panels on their rooftop. And each utility is a little bit different, and the commission is going to be investigating that further. But in general, they have a threshold as far as if you have a quote-unquote small Tier 1 installation. Typically, it's 20 kilowatts alternating current or less, but that does vary utility by utility. If it is that threshold or under, you are subject to net metering, which usually means that within a monthly bill cycle, your energy consumption and your energy production are looked together and netted out, and your production offsets your energy usage. So if you had 100 units per month that you used and you produced 80 units per month, you'll only have to pay for the 20 units of excess consumption within that monthly billing cycle, and essentially your production then avoids your retail charge, the kilowatt hour usage that you would be subject to for that volumetric kilowatt hour rate.
Yeah, so it gets a bit complicated, right? The tariff, not only, like you said, there's a fixed charge, there's volumetric charges, there's fuel adjustments, there's your relationship if you have a solar or solar plus storage system. There's also time of use rates. I want to talk about why and what you're seeing with time of use rates. Why would a utility, for example, charge you different at one time of day than another time of day?
Most residential customers are not required to sign up for time of use rates, but they are available. So time of use rate would encourage you to use energy at different times of the day. Sometimes there's seasonality as well, but most of the time it's just basic time of use rate would be 12 hours on peak and 12 hours off peak. And the on peak may start 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning and go until 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening, and say at this point in time, prices are the highest. So you should shift your usage, if you can, to the off-peak time, which is starting at 7 or 8 p.m. In the evening. And the reason for that is it impacts utility investments, which if we want to make sure that utilities don't have to have what's oftentimes called a peaker plant. And historically, these have been natural gas units that are built to serve that summer peak when everybody's flipping on their air conditioning in the summer afternoon and a really, really hot weekday, for example. They are built to serve that peak, the marginal peak usage. They only get turned on in that summer afternoon when everyone's flipping on their air conditioning. And utilities have to make those investments because electricity is required to be available 24/7, 365. And so to the extent that utilities can have time of use rates to shift customer usage to those off-peak time periods, then less investment in particularly those peaker type of units are needed, and it's more than cost effective for all retail customers. So not only does it reduce that customer's individual bill, they shift their usage to lower price periods in the off-peak periods, but then the utilities have to invest in less generation resources in general, and long-term it will also result in less transmission and other equipment as well. So then there's less infrastructure that needs to be invested to serve the individual customers, and everyone benefits from lower rates in the long run.
But we've been kind of stuck in this residential rate conversation, but there really are three classes of customers that the utilities service. You want to talk about those different classes and how that interplay happens during this kind of tariff conversation at the Public Service Commission?
The three class types that you mentioned are residential, commercial, and industrial. And in general, they're classified based on how much energy they use over the course of time, as well as how much energy they use at a particular point in time, which is called your demand for electricity. And if it's based on a coincident time, that summer afternoon or early summer evening, it's how much demand do you have for electricity, which would be measured in a kilowatt. How many kilowatts do you demand at that particular point in time? And residential customers, they'll be based on, their air conditioning unit that's on, their refrigerator that may be running, and larger appliances that may be running at that particular time. If you switch on your TV and your computer's running, for example. But for commercial customers, there's a lot of refrigeration that will occur if you're at a Walmart, for example, and air conditioning and lighting, obviously. And then for industrial customers, if they are producing at full tilt, there's a lot of motors and drives associated with their demand, lighting, obviously, any type of heating and cooling that may be needed. And in general, the larger you go from smaller commercial to medium and large commercial and ultimately industrial customer, they have a much higher demand for electricity. And that also drives distribution investments that must occur in order to serve that very large demand at those peak times. So there may be individual transformers that are designed for those large commercial and industrial customers. And then in the tariff, it is stated how all of these charges must take place, and they're usually a lot more sophisticated than residential customer class. So there are demand charges based on your kilowatt use at those peak times, or even what's called a customer demand. Your peak demand might be in the middle of the night if you're an industrial customer, but it doesn't matter. It still drives that distribution investment needed to serve your load. And so those new demand charges start to take place and are required for medium commercial and larger industrial customers as well. And the energy managers associated with those commercial and industrial customers must come up with unique ways to lower their demand at those key times and lower their utility bills ultimately.
Yeah, so you had mentioned previously these two motivations of the Public Service Commission, which is reliability and constraining costs on ratepayers. They do have this third, though, which is cross-subsidization and making sure that these three different classes, I guess would be pay their fair share, quote unquote. I want to talk about kind of how that plays out in front of the Public Service Commission and how they deal with these issues, how much to charge an industrial customer versus how much to charge a residential customer.
Yeah, so that's always a big contentious issue before the Public Service Commission during these rate cases, and usually residential and small commercial customers are represented by the Citizens Utility Board, and then larger customers may represent themselves before the Public Service Commission, and then there's a group of larger industrial customers that come together as the Wisconsin Industrial Energy Group, and so there's an advocate for industrial customers that has expert testimony and legal representation before the Public Service Commission as well. And it's not just all rhetorical battle as far as like I should be paid less and they should be paying more. There's something that's called a cost of service study. And that's something that larger utilities that have their own utility models, software models, will run these cost of service studies that show all the customers' unique profiles, how they add up into that customer class, all the demand for current infrastructure and new infrastructure that these customer profiles are requiring. And then in a cost causation principle, the cost of service study will look at how much cost are you causing, and therefore how much should you pay as a total, usually in the millions of dollars for a customer class. How much should you have to pay in this upcoming year, which is called a test year. So last year when we were working on rate cases, it was a 2023 test year. And it's based on that forward-looking forecast of how much energy you're going to be using and when, and how much is that going to drive costs for the utility, both historical costs that are embedded in their what's called a revenue requirement, how much total the utility needs to operate, and forward-looking costs as far as new investments the utility will have to make. And it's not cut and dry. It is a science in a way, and the cost of service study is set up and it runs that model, and the numbers kick out for each individual customer class. But there are arguments about the methodology in which the cost of service study is based, and usually there will be 4, 5, 6 different model runs based on the preferences of these different advocates before the Public Service Commission. So there's some model runs that will show that residential customers should pay less, and other model runs that show that industrial customers should pay less. And ultimately, it's up to the Public Service Commission, those 3 individual commissioners, to assess all the information that's before them, and either in a weighted measure among all of these models, or they could choose one in particular if they're convinced that's the right way of doing the cost of service study, and ultimately, end of the day, allocate the revenue. So it's called revenue allocation. It's a big old pie that might be, multiple billions of dollars that the utility needs in this upcoming year. How much percentage should be allocated to the residential, commercial, and industrial classes? And then after that, that's when the rate design happens to make sure that revenue requirement per customer class is collected based on the profile, again, of those customer class types.
Yeah, so that gets, as you mentioned, quite complicated, and there's the art to it, right? And that art becomes more complicated as markets change. And So we talked a bit about how the Public Service Commission serves in some sense to regulate or control the type and scale of utility investments. And then you've explained to us a bit how the rates are designed to recover those investments. But the Public Service Commission also has to deal with some emerging policy issues, like interpreting state law as new things develop and new things advance. So you want to talk with us a little bit about how the Public Service Commission engages in that type of policy debate?
We talked about kind of the two core application types before the Public Service Commission, being construction cases and rate cases. But then there are other types of cases that are, again, legal proceedings before the commissioners to gather evidence and make a decision that are other or miscellaneous in nature. They could be utility programs for energy efficiency, demand-side management, renewable energy. They could be an investigation which the commission starts. It's not a utility application, but the commission itself starts as an investigation to look at a particular policy. And over the last decade, the commission has opened investigations on electric vehicles, how natural gas extension costs are handled across utilities, how focus on energy is some of the administrative rules that how focus on energy is implemented. And more recently, the commission has opened up investigations on distributed generation or parallel generation, it's often called, as well as the roadmap to zero carbon, the general goal to get to zero carbon by 2050. It's an open-ended investigation. The commission can choose how they want to investigate, how they want to set up a proceeding, what type of information they want to gather. And oftentimes it comes out with memoranda for comment that the commission staff put out in a very detailed manner, and parties and citizens have the opportunity to provide comments to those memoranda and influence the commission's decision on the structure of those investigations, as well as ultimately the decisions that are made in those investigations. So those are a couple of common examples that occur before the commission, but there are as well unique cases that come before the Public Service Commission, one of which is a declaratory ruling that may be requested by a retail customer, a utility, a business within the state, in which there's something with regards to law that is up for interpretation, and there's a request for clarification that the commissioners look at this issue in an in-depth manner, gather information, and clarify how the law is interpreted for utility regulation. And so we've seen those throughout the years. They're a little bit more rare in nature. Oftentimes the commission doesn't take up and those rules. They consider the request, but they don't make a ruling in that case. But sometimes they make rulings as well and add a little bit of clarity. And it's an important interpretation for economic, how businesses operate, how the utilities operate, and it adds clarity for just the nature of utility regulation.
It's hard to avoid this conclusion that we ask a lot of our Public Service Commission, and it's interesting to think that this is in Wisconsin, it's a 3-person appointed body, and as we know, the political winds can change dramatically between a Republican and a Democratic administration, and the commissioners they appoint can, as you said, they can definitely interpret the art very differently.
For sure.
And one of the ways that states, since we are kind of this 50-state experiment, which we'll start talking about in a little bit, mm-hmm. One of the ways that states have helped to kind of like manage this has been through integrated resource planning, which is these kind of like long-term planning cycles that empower the commission staff with information to understand the future and the past. Do you want to talk about what is an integrated resource plan and the value that it provides to like a regulator?
So integrated resource plans, or IRPs as they're typically called in the industry, are very common among retail regulated states. So our neighbors in Minnesota and Michigan, they have IRP planning processes that occur on a cycle for utilities that come in with not individual applications for a generation asset, for example, but a plan for a whole swath or tranche of generation units that will be needed over the course of several years. And so this allows a lot of policy and contextual information to be put into commission decisions. So, for example, we've got a general goal for getting to zero carbon by 2050. We've got a goal to better integrate electric vehicle and just electrification of transportation in general. We've got a goal to look at not just a general individual generating unit, but a whole tranche of generating units, how much is going to be needed over the coming years so that we can put them in relation to each other and all the alternatives that may exist for those investments. And then in all of that context, allow the commission to make a decision on what will be allowed and not allowed as far as investments over the coming years through this very, very large proceeding that takes place. I've never participated in one because Wisconsin doesn't have an integrated resource plan in the state of Wisconsin. We can talk a little bit about the law there as well. The Public Service Commission right now, because of the law, cannot create that process. But we did at one point have what's called an advanced plan, which is very similar to an IRP that exists currently in other states. And right now we have a strategic energy assessment, which is a biennial, every other year planning process that occurs with utilities, but it's kind of like an IRP light. It's not something, when a commission reviews the information, they put out a report, but it has no teeth. It doesn't require the utilities to make investments or not make certain investments, to create certain programs or not create certain programs. It's something that is just for informational purposes. The commission could hypothetically take that information and open up an investigation or have an order in a different docket then based on information to require utilities to do certain things. In that biennial docket that happens every other year, the Strategic Energy Assessment, or SEA, is an IRP light that just is a information gathering exercise basically.
Especially in today's context with such a dynamic market, even just at the beginning of our conversation, when I asked, what has you excited, you're talking about kind of load forecasting with electrification and how important that's going to be. In an integrated resource plan, it seems to me one of the major values of that type of process is to true up assumptions, right? Because as you mentioned, the utilities are interested in building things because they have a protected rate of return, and that's how their investors make more money. So they might say, oh, we're forecasting natural gas prices to be this, or we're forecasting customer load to be this, growing to justify, a new investment. And in an IRP plan, you can say, as a public service commission, you could say, hey, well, 3 years ago, you said this was going to happen, and the opposite happened. Why were you so wrong? Whereas if you don't have an integrated resource planning process, it's kind of like you're kind of just every year is a new year. So am I off here, or is that one of the values that you also see in an IRP process?
Right, that's exactly it. You're talking about forecasting and predicting in the future, what load will materialize with regards to electric vehicles and, the weather and economic conditions that are driving new business and new load. So, like I said, in construction cases and in rate cases, it's oftentimes a test year, a single year looking forward future. Strategic energy assessment is a 6-year window that's forward looking, even though there's no teeth in the decision. It does give a snapshot at that point in time what the future loads, what the future assets will be with regards to retirements that are planned, with regards to generation resources that are planned, to provide the commissioners with a little bit of context. But traditionally an IRP will have that in a more formal setting to determine what the load forecast will be in different scenarios. So oftentimes there's not just one model run in which you have one single forecast, but you'll have a variance of several scenarios that will allow you to say, in this extreme end, this will happen. In this other extreme end, this will happen, which will then cause us to we'll either need this investment or we won't. And it's up to interpretation because we don't know what the economy is going to be. We don't know what the penetration of electric vehicles is going to be 10 years from now. So it allows for a lot of uncertainty to be considered once again and then debated over, and the commission making the final call at the end of the day as far as what is the most realistic scenario or what do we have to plan for. Oftentimes the commission is as they should be, very concerned about reliability. So if there's a concern about whether or not really a generation unit will be needed, whether or not the load will materialize, well, if that load materializes and you guess that it didn't, you're going to be in trouble, right? So there's, and all of the load forecasting as well, there's margins that are, if certain conditions were to happen and this generation unit were to trip and not be available, we have to have another unit in backup. If load is all of a sudden a lot higher than we thought because we just can't control a load, then we need to have an extra margin put on top of that as well. So the commission is able to, in an IRP type of setting, gather this additional information and choose, with all of these variables in the assumptions of the forecast, choose what we really need to be planning for with regards to generation assets and transmission assets, distribution assets if they're needed, as well as how do we engage customers to modify their load, reduce their load, their energy use overall, as well as shifting their energy use at different times of the day so that we don't have to build those peaker units that sit idle most of the year but just come online, if you will, during those summer afternoons.
We talk specifically about the Public Service Commission's role in investor-owned utilities for hours and hours. First, I'm going to apologize to our listeners, because if you think this is complex, we're only going to get more complex, because before we get, our goal is here to circle back and have conversations about specific policies and programs and how those come to life. But we have to first address the other types of utilities and their motivations for making decisions. Then we should talk about the difference between regulated and deregulated states, and then we can get back to your original comment about wholesale markets and how we're all subject to them. But first, let's move away from investor-owned utilities. And can you talk to us about, and maybe again we can stay in this Wisconsin context because I think it's pretty descriptive of how this works across the country. But how about municipal and cooperative utilities? What role does the Public Service Commission have with them, and how do they make decisions, and how are their decisions maybe different than, how are their motivations different than, say, an investor-owned utility?
So yeah, Wisconsin has a lot of municipal electric utilities as well as cooperative electric utilities in the state. And, each state is different with regards to retail regulation, those that do have retail regulation. Wisconsin has retail regulation over municipal utilities, whereas other states like California do not have regulation over municipal utilities, and they are left to independently regulate themselves, essentially. We can talk a little bit about governance, but Wisconsin does regulate municipal electric utilities when it comes to retail rates, and does not retail regulate electric cooperatives. So they form their own board of directors, and they form their own bylaws and regulatory structure. And in the day, they come up with their own proceeding types to take place with regards to investments that need to happen, with regards to rate cases, with regards to new programs that are offered to their customers, with regards to addressing policy issues such as renewable energy development and zero carbon goals. They're left to deal with that on their own, in their own individual utility territory. And a lot of times farmers and commercial customers that operate in the small towns that operate in rural areas, they have to serve all of those customers, and then they're still interconnected to the transmission lines ultimately, and are subject to wholesale markets as well. So they have to navigate all of those dynamics on their own. And oftentimes they are part of larger associations or corporations that provide these wholesale services for them. The two largest in the state of Wisconsin are WPPI Energy. They serve mostly municipal utilities, but there are maybe some cooperative members that they have as well. And then Dairyland Power Cooperative is a wholesale member for a lot of electric co-ops in the state of Wisconsin. I think they may have a few municipal customers as well. So those are large associations, membership-based, of municipal and cooperative utilities that essentially pool their load and resources together to have wholesale services provided on their behalf, and allows them to have a little bit of economies of scale like the investor utilities enjoy themselves as well, and to diversify their capital structure and investment opportunities, and allow a wholesale tariff rate to serve those individual utility members as well. So in general, once again, going back to the Public Service Commission regulation, Public Service Commission is in charge of regulating municipal electric utilities, but not cooperative utilities. And with regards to some larger policy issues, such as implementation of focus on energy program, the Commission does interface with electric cooperatives and how they either participate in that program or run their own individual energy efficiency programs. And the same thing with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which was already met about 10 years ago now. But that did require a certain amount of renewable development to serve individual electric utilities throughout the state, including municipal and cooperative utilities as well. And so the Commission would have some jurisdictional oversight over those policy issues, but that's only due to legislation that happened a long time ago, in which state legislators said this policy issue is big enough that we are going to also require it of municipal and electric cooperative utilities as well.
The concept of the cooperative utility, as you mentioned, where there's local elected boards that do shared governance of these distribution cooperatives, and then there's the generation and transmission cooperative that they generally buy power from and have a contract with. You also mentioned when we started talking about the formation of cooperatives, which happened after the Great Depression and the New Deal era, where basically, and it still is true today, the USDA created the Rural Utility Service to provide low to zero cost loans for infrastructure, because the investor-owned utilities were just serving areas of high population density, and most of the country, 75% of the country wasn't served, and 75% of the country still is served by cooperatives today. And one of the features that's often shared between municipal and cooperative utilities, but particularly cooperative utilities, is they have many fewer customers per line mile than an investor-owned utility. Can you talk a little bit about how that shapes their kind of like rate design and their policy, having to serve fewer customers with more infrastructure?
Yeah, it's exactly right. So they don't have the economies of scale with regards to customer base that either a municipal or investor-owned utility have. And there's a lot of rural area in Wisconsin that's served by investor-owned utilities as well. So both Wisconsin Public Service and We Energies have a lot of, especially in northeastern Wisconsin, a lot of rural territory as well. So it's not like every single rural area is covered by electric cooperative. But then, those investor-owned utilities have that dynamic of both urban and rural territory, whereas a sole electric cooperative is usually maybe a town and a whole bunch of surrounding rural area. And so, they'll have large loads associated with individual farmers, but then a lot of miles in between other types of loads and townships that occur. So that's really why they were the last to be electrified, because there wasn't a huge capital motivation for businesses to come and form utilities and serve those customers, because they would have to make huge investments in especially distribution networks to serve and equipment to serve these customers, and they would have a limited amount of return because the load or sales of electricity would be a lot less than these more dense suburban and urban territories. So that's where the federal government came in and provide funding opportunities, stabilization, financial stabilization for these cooperatives to be formed, and providing networks of service so that they could rely upon each other and with regards to resources and financing, and then ultimately allowing them to create their own board of directors and office administration, as well as field crews and procurement of installation of distribution services with contractors as well. So it's still to this day, rural service territories probably have a lot more load than they did back in the Great Depression time period and the period just after that, due to just modernization, right? And rural area being more filled out by sprawl of suburban area and townships and such. But in general, the economies of scale are still not comparable to municipal and investor-owned utilities. So there's still a lot of pressure for cooperative utilities to make sure that they provide reliable service and very cost-effective services. So they are probably very well represented by agricultural customers and their board of directors, or those board of directors that have close relations with agricultural businesses within their service territory. And they're able, because they're not regulated by the Public Service Commission. If the Public Service Commission has a desire for uniformity of certain policy implementation, they don't have to do that if it doesn't fit their electric cooperative, for example, and they can come up with unique solutions to the problems that they face.
Yes, very interesting dynamic there. Maybe before we escape the state of Wisconsin and talk about other state approaches and wholesale markets, let's go up one layer in this onion, right? We talked about utility service territory. We talked about the Public Service Commission and their full retail rate regulation over IOUs and their engagement with municipal utilities, partial engagement with cooperative utilities. But maybe we should talk about state legislation, because that is kind of the one ring that rules them all in the state. We are this 50-state experiment, this balkanized energy market. What authority and what influence does, say, the state legislature have in passing rules? And then maybe after that we'll talk about the limits of just executive orders and how those work. But like state legislation, how does that impact energy markets?
If you consider all of the individual retail utilities in the state of Wisconsin, state legislation has a huge opportunity for impact there. And throughout the decades and century plus now, there has been definitive legislation coming down with regards to how should these utilities operate in our state, how should they be regulated by the Public Service Commission, and what individual rules must they follow, as well as policies that must be implemented and adhered to across these utilities. And the very nature of the structure of utilities obviously has changed over time, over this course of the century plus, and part of that is due to major legislation that happened before Wisconsin, especially, in modern times. In the 90s, there was an evolution across the nation with regards to deregulation, the idea that we can look at the individual sections of the grid, distribution, transmission, and generation, for example, and we can split those up into different ownership types, and we can create a market for energy, and we can have all of these different entities participate in that wholesale market, make investments based on price signals, based on changing customer demand, and then interface and have a competitive market. So if you live in Madison, you could choose whatever utility you wanted. And there's still some limitation of that. You don't want to have 10 distribution feeder lines coming down to your house and have to pay for all of them just to have a choice of that. So because the grid is totally interconnected, you still have one set of distribution lines that would have to be managed by a distribution utility, but then the energy provider that would be essentially your wholesale manager on your behalf could go to the wholesale market, act on your behalf based on your demand, and then give you a bill that does have the distribution costs regardless of your usage and your energy provider embedded in there. But then wholesale charges and such will vary between the particular energy provider that you choose. So that's a deregulated environment that a lot of states in the 80s and 90s looked into and actually ended up implementing. So in the New England states, Pennsylvania up through New England, Massachusetts and such, will have deregulated states that have this structure available. Illinois in the Midwest is a key example. Texas, of course, is a key example. California started going that direction, and they had problems in the early 2000s, so they kind of pulled back and decided we still need to regulate our investor-owned utilities. Wisconsin, of course, is a unique example as well. So there was a lot of investigation into deregulation in the 1990s, I believe, at the Public Service Commission as well as the legislature, discussion about how should Wisconsin adopt, as all these other states are looking at this. We want to have the efficiency of a market-based competitive market for electricity, and how should we adopt? So Wisconsin started going down that route in general in a very cautious way, and had bits of legislation that had portions of deregulation, But I think in general, in the early 2000s, especially with the California energy crisis that took place, there was reliability issues that took place in the state of Wisconsin in the late 1990s as well. That there all of a sudden was a pullback and said, well, we need to have some regulation over especially reliability in our state. So we just don't want to give that up to the market, in which, there could be bad actors out there that for their own benefit to make a lot of money in a certain situation, even if it's against reliability. There could be lack of investments that could happen. And again, so if there's that summer peak time in the afternoon, there's not enough transmission to get the energy to where it needs to be, or there's not enough peaker units to ramp up at that particular point in time because the price signal wasn't there. So there's a lot of conversation that happened, and in 1999 there was a major piece of legislation called Wisconsin Act 9, and a part of that is called the Reliability 2000, also called Transco legislation, that created ATC, American Transmission Company, and all the major utilities that were essentially in the eastern 2/3 of Wisconsin had to be part of that new transmission company. So they had to sell their assets to this new forming ATC company, and then that legislation required them to participate in a burgeoning wholesale market that was then called MISO and still called MISO today. And so that was something in which it was a step towards deregulation, if you will, but then the brakes were pumped on that, and ultimately just an assessment of what was going on in Wisconsin, what was going on in the rest of the nation. No further steps were taken, and we're left with a very interesting set of regulations and utility structures in the state, but something that really hasn't changed much since. We've got ATC in the eastern 2/3 of Wisconsin, and Xcel Energy, or Northern States Power, still owns their own transmission. Dairyland Power Cooperative, which is that association that I told you about earlier of electric cooperatives in Wisconsin, they own a lot of transmission in Wisconsin. Those are usually that western third of Wisconsin, for example. And so we're left with those three primary transmission owners in the state, and all of the distribution electric utilities still have monopoly service territory over their own individual service areas in the state of Wisconsin. And that's just kind of the nature of the structure and regulation ever since in the early 2000s.
And through that kind of grand bargain, which, in the context of legislation, how, you're telling us a bit of history of Wisconsin to show what an impact that state legislatures can have on markets, whether it's deregulating like in Illinois, or kind of this grand bargain like we have in Wisconsin, which ended advanced planning. So coming out of that, somehow we were like, okay, I guess we don't need a 10-year plan, but also gave us this state public benefits program, right, focused on energy, which puts about 1.3 cents of every dollar we spend on our utility bill into a pot that funds energy efficiency. And the way I think about it, it's kind of like one of the only forms of competition we have in the state, because the more rates that are collected, the more that goes into focus on energy. It incentivizes energy efficiency. The higher the rates go, the more those investments pay back for the consumer. So you want to talk about the focus on energy program? What's its impact? How is it regulated, I guess? Who oversees it?
So in mentioning that 1999 Act 9, that was the creation of the Public Benefits Program, which all utilities in the state were required to put money into a common pot statewide. It was initially run by the Department of Administration, Wisconsin state agency, and essentially there was an energy efficiency program that became focused on energy, and there was a low-income program, primarily weatherization programs that happened as well, and there was a limited amount of investment that was required from all the utility types, investor-owned, municipal, and cooperative utilities. And actually in 2005, there was Act 141. So that was a major overhaul of that program. Focus on Energy in particular was The regulation was moved over to the Public Service Commission, and it was independently administered by a third party through a very robust RFP process. It still occurs to this day. A quadrennial planning process was taken up by the Public Service Commission. With this more oversight and stronger structure and support system set up, then a larger investment requirement was was required of utilities. So investor-owned utilities have to put in about 1.2% of their operating revenue every year into this common bucket, if you will, for focus on energy, and municipal and electric cooperatives have more of like it's an $8 per meter structure that they put into this common bucket and participate on focus on energy. The public benefits portion of low-income programs are still primarily run by the Department of Administration. My understanding, Public Service Commission does assist there with regards to how the money is collected through the bills and implemented, and coordination with utilities and the DOA. And then all of this going on as well is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which we've talked about a little bit, but that was also part of the initial 1999 Act 9 legislation. It was a very minor requirement. So it was an acknowledgement that renewable energy is good. We need more renewable energy. We need to track this. But there wasn't really much of a requirement put on utilities at that time. But then during the expansion of Focus on Energy also came the expansion of the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program in Wisconsin with Wisconsin Act 141 that was I believe passed in law 2005, truly implemented in 2006 and there later, which for the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, required statewide on average utilities to procure about 10% of the electricity that they procure from renewable resources. And the actual individual requirements are different utility by utility based on their baseline of how much renewable energy they had in a time period 2001 to 2003, which at that point in time was a lot of hydro and landfill, a little bit of wind here and there. But it was a low baseline unless a utility was very hydroelectric heavy, for example, at that time, and it required them to step up their amounts of renewable energy procurement. It's actually a really good story because utilities were able to, once they understood how it was going to be implemented, make a lot of renewable energy investments, a lot of wind, both in the state of Wisconsin and outside of the state, with our western neighbors in Iowa, Minnesota, for example, where the wind regime is a little bit better there. So they were able to make the investments and develop these renewable resources and hit that standard early, I think right around 2012. The standard was 10% by 2015, and by 2012 the utilities were actually able to realize 10% statewide, and ultimately that law is still on the books, still implemented on a year-by-year basis, but now the utilities don't have that mandate to increase renewable energy any further, but they have their own goals to get to zero carbon, which is great. So they've been developing wind and solar resources ever since and expanding their renewable resource portfolio development. So yeah, in general, going back, that was required by legislation, and the Public Service Commission, especially with some of the restrictions that were put in those grand bargain type of legislation, the Public Service Commission has a restriction. They can't really force additional energy efficiency and renewable energy investment to occur through that legislation. However, the utilities have been doing that just through their own natural incentives, if you will, to make sure they have sustainable energy and provide energy efficiency programs that go above and beyond focus on energy investments, and have renewable resource investments that go above and beyond their RPS requirements, simply because their customers are demanding renewable energy, clean energy, getting to zero carbon by 2050.
Yeah, it's a really good explanation of the kind of the influence that the state legislatures have over markets and all of the impacts. And since that time, we've had very little state legislation, whereas other states have. Maybe before we talk about that, though, the impacts, for example, the Focus on Energy program, the audits can always come back and show that for every dollar that we invest as ratepayers, it saves us $5-ish. So what a program that saved Wisconsin money that came from the legislature. Just going around the Midwest, you can see just in recent years, Iowa, dramatic expansion of net metering statewide through state legislation. Minnesota, the Minnesota Solar Energy Jobs Act established the Community Solar Program in Excel territory, over 800 megawatts of community solar there. Illinois, very aggressive renewable portfolio standard, Clean Energy Jobs Act, community choice aggregation in Ohio. So many different pieces of state legislation that have markets for better or for worse. Maybe we can take this community solar piece, because I know at Renew Wisconsin, you're part of a coalition that was supporting some legislation here. We get questions all the time at MREA about community solar and how do I get access to community solar? And my short answer is always, well, your utility has to have a voluntary program, or you have to pass legislation. And not all community solar is created equally. So would you talk to us a little bit about what, so we don't have any mandates in Wisconsin, we don't have any legislation, but we do have some community solar. So we have community solar now. How did that come about? What is it? And what would be different if we passed this community solar legislation that was formed but didn't kind of like really move out of committee last year?
As you stated, there hasn't been community solar legislation requiring that to happen either through utilities or outside of utilities independently in the state of Wisconsin. However, we've had individual programs developed voluntarily from especially most of the larger investor-owned utilities in the state of Wisconsin. There's also been some smaller investor-owned utilities, some municipal utilities, and I believe there's some electric cooperative community solar projects happening as well. But basically around 2015, some of the larger utilities such as MG&E, Alliant Energy, and Xcel Energy started to put forward proposals before the Public Service Commission to say, our customers are seeing this happen in other states. They want to make an investment in a smaller, it's not a rooftop solar. It's usually in a field or a farmer's field, and it could be a megawatt of solar or less, or it could be more. But they want to subscribe to a portion of that solar installation and be able to claim that they're using that energy. And so we want to set up a program that allows them to make, in most cases, a large upfront investment on usually it's a dollars per kW portion of that facility, and it's usually sized to serve their average load, right, in an energy for energy basis. And they make that investment, and then they get credits on their bills, like a cents per kilowatt hour credit on their bill throughout their contract term, which could be 15, 20 years. It's usually associated with the expected lifetime of that solar installation. These applications came before the Public Service Commission, and at that time it was all Walker appointees, so all Republican the commissioners, and but they saw these were utility programs. The customers were demanding it, and a big thing for the commissioners at that time, as well as still today, is no cross-subsidization. So we want to make sure that those customers who are voluntarily participating and subscribing to these solar projects are paying for those solar projects. And all those customers that do not want to pay for those solar projects do not have to pay for those projects. So as long as the accounting is set up appropriately, where the utility is gathering the revenue needed to make these projects happen, the bill credits are set up that it's based on what's called the avoided costs of the utility, and it's a fair compensation for the subscribers who are voluntarily participating in these programs. Sure, we'll allow these programs to happen. And they've been very successful, and almost all of those projects that have been developed in the state of Wisconsin have been fully subscribed. So that's good news for those folks who really wanted to get in early and subscribe to some of these community solar projects, but bad news if you just now are learning about this and are in maybe Excel's territory or MG&E's territory, and it's fully subscribed and you just don't have access to that program anymore. The utility may consider expansion of that program, as MG&E has done. They've done 2 or 3 expansions of that program now, and I'm not 100% sure if MG&E has a portion of their community solar still available or not. But in general, most of the projects are fully subscribed in the investor-owned utility service territories, some of the municipal and cooperative utilities for the most part. And so they were successful, but they haven't been expanded quite a bit. But then the next concept, which I'm sure you want to talk about, is developer-owned or third-party community solar. And that would essentially require legislation to happen. Very similar concept of utility community solar. Probably the rate structure would be a little bit different in that the rate structure would likely be more of a pay-as-you-save type of program, in which the customer that's subscribing to that developer-owned community solar program would pay a cents per kilowatt hour basis every month based on their subscription amount and how much the actual production occurred, and then get on their utility bill a bill credit as well. That would be on a cents per kilowatt hour basis. There may be also some upfront investment required that depends upon the business structure and the contract that the developer-owned community solar business would set up. So because it would require interaction with the utility bill, because it would require interconnection of this community solar, obviously not at the customer's premises, but farther away, probably within that utility service territory at the distribution grid, but again, not directly connected to the retail customers that are subscribing to that community solar installation. It would require a lot of integration of billing and administration, and would require ultimately legislation to happen in the state of Wisconsin.
So if you wanted to have uniform rules and expand access and require that utilities offer this, you'd have to have legislation. If not, you're going to get what the utilities propose in a voluntary sense. So I think that's a very good distinction between, like how a state legislatures can have an impact over the energy market and affect opportunities for customers. Okay, so what we've done so far, we've talked about Public Service Commission regulation, types of utilities, we've talked about state legislature. We are all, even though we're all 50 states and we all have 50 experiments, we are all subject to these wholesale markets. So I'll set this up for you a little bit. That the wholesale markets, like you said, we're in the MISO territory. And this actually is, this is also federal intervention to create these markets, to create competition in wholesale electricity. And this is around the same time as PURPA, which required that utilities also purchase power at wholesale prices. This PURPA avoided cost rate from independent merchant generators, so it allowed for the development of wind and hydro all across the country in these competitive markets. One of the things that's really interesting to me about this is that, decisions at the federal level and the wholesale market level from, the wholesale market regulators, and the state level and the commission level and the utility level and the customer level are all interacting in this market in different time frames. And so it's really, when somebody says, why don't we just do this? The question is really like, who would do it, right? Because there are so many actors here. So when you see what's happening in the wholesale markets, what are some of the things that you think people should know, how they work, and what are the influence over the utility system currently?
Best to kind of take a step back first and talk about, federal jurisdiction versus state jurisdiction. In general, federal jurisdiction is over interstate commerce, and that has been determined to be at the transmission level, where obviously the transmission grid, there's 3 grids across the United States. We're in the Eastern Interconnect here in Wisconsin. Power flows across that grid in an interstate manner, and the buying and selling of the energy that flows on that grid is interstate commerce. So a long, long time ago, it was decided that's federal jurisdiction, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was created to regulate transmission companies, generators that are interconnected at the transmission level, utilities that are interconnected at the transmission level, and establish infrastructure development that occurs there and how that pricing of transmission lines is structured, as well as wholesale market development and transmission planning that occurs and how the markets are developed. And there's different regions across the United States, different wholesale markets developed. And in the Midwest here, we have what's called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. Used to be the Midwest, but it expanded down into the South. So going along the Mississippi, essentially, all the way down into Arkansas, Mississippi, parts of Texas, and Missouri, so states along the Mississippi. And even though the market doesn't extend into Canada, north of the Midwest, there are generation and transmission resources that are interconnected into MISO as well, and are serve as external resources, as they're called. So, all the way from Manitoba to Louisiana, there's essentially resources associated with the MISO wholesale market. And when it comes to state regulation is over the intrastate or within the state commerce. So that's retail distribution customers that have a limited geographic service territory, and all of their customers that are served within that geographic service territory, and the distribution system that's required to serve those customers. Obviously, that's all these distribution utilities are interconnected, and then they all go onto the interstate highway of the transmission system as well. So there's a lot of gray area that occurs with regards to federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. And, distributed resources serve as a key example, whereas obviously it's interconnected at the distribution level, which is subject to state regulation, but they have the ability to interconnect and influence the wholesale market. In the future, they could, even in MISO, interconnect and participate in the wholesale market as they are allowed to in other wholesale markets. And in fact, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has put forward a ruling that all wholesale markets must adjust their systems to allow distributed energy resources to participate in wholesale markets. So it's going to be a while before that's implemented in MISO, in our region, in Wisconsin, but eventually that must occur due to a federal ruling that took place a while ago. So you mentioned PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 1978, and that's been updated several times since. So that occurred during an energy crisis of the 1970s when OPEC was created. We had oil shortages. We had a lot of petroleum regulation with regards to, I think the miles per hour was reduced to 55 and a lot of interstate highways to have more efficient use of oil in general. And it also came down to natural gas and electric utilities as well to make sure that there would be more efficient use, that there would be creation of eventually wholesale markets. There would be oversight of the transmission investment to make sure that markets could happen, competitive nature of the industry could flourish. And so that has influenced how wholesale markets have formed and has influenced how distribution is treated as well, distributed generation, because PURPA basically said these utility service territories that have monopoly service territories can't block the participation of these distributed resources. They could be, a small rooftop installation, or it could be a large biomass resource that's in an industrial customer's facility. It could be a large hydro facility that, just took place at a paper production facility a long time ago. And all of these resources either have to directly access the wholesale market, or the Public Service Commission at each individual state has to devise buyback rates that are based on the utility's avoided cost and that simulates a wholesale market participation. So that is something in which, through PURPA, rule creation and interpretation, guidance was handed down to state regulatory authorities to implement their own state policies, but based on the federal guidelines that allow open access and competition even at the distribution level, because those distributed resources can still impact the wholesale market in a good way as well.
It's so complicated. You do a really good job of kind of explaining it, and maybe we can use a bit of an example here, so I'll set you up. I know we have only a little time left, so we're not going to quite get to the global implications, for example, of us intervening in the Yom Kippur War and Iranian oil embargoes and PURPA. That surely the global influences with war in Ukraine, climate change, and all this stuff surely influence. But let's just stick here to the wholesale markets, sure. And we'll use this one example. So if we think about this in an interesting way, these layers of decision making, you talked about PURPA and kind of the development of these merchant generators competing in the wholesale markets. We know that wholesale markets work through these auction mechanisms. Basically, the cheapest power available at the location is sold first, and once the full quantity or demand need is met, then the auction is cleared, which means that the most expensive power sources don't sell. So here we go. We have competitive markets. We have states approving coal-fired power plants that last 30 to 40 years, nuclear power plants that last 30 to 40 years. But as those plants are operating, then we incentivize through tax credits, production tax credit for wind and investment tax credit through federal legislation. We open up wholesale markets. There's competition. Wind and solar get cheaper. Energy efficiency is surely cheaper. Now with FERC orders, you're going to see more of these services in the wholesale market. And lo and behold, what happens, Andrew? Where are we at? What is happening in the wholesale market with the proliferation of solar and wind? What is happening to these kind of like legacy, I guess, fossil fuel and nuclear generators?
There's a debate and conversation about how to cost effectively retire fossil fuel units. And ultimately, it's up to the state jurisdiction in each instance. So those fossil fuel units in Wisconsin are owned by investor-owned utilities that are regulated by the Public Service Commission. So a long time ago as well, there was pieces of legislation that allowed for something called securitization of, especially the environmental controls of especially coal units, but also unique financing mechanisms to retire coal units in particular right now in a way that reduces the impact, especially if they're still, it's quote unquote, used and useful. So if they were approved by the Public Service Commission 20 years ago, for example, they may have assumed it had a 30 to 40 year lifetime. And so all of those costs were embedded into rates on a depreciation schedule that was in accordance with the useful life of that unit. So it might be 30 to 40 years, but it's only 20 years old. But at the same time, now the unit, just with the fuel costs that they face with regards to coal deliveries, with regards to controls that were required to be installed by the federal EPA, with regards to the prices that come down from MISO and what the demand is for that unit, and in relation to the levelized cost of energy that it can produce and the MISO LMP energy prices that they're given, it's obvious that these units are becoming uneconomic. And utilities have been trying to plan for retirement of the units. The other complicating factor is reliability. And that's something in which, even if a unit is uneconomic, there has to be a study that occurs and say, we want to retire this coal unit because it's uneconomic. And of course, there's environmental concerns as well. And MISO then works with transmission companies and other generating units to get a sense of, again, the demand and generation that occurs within a certain area, and determine, well, if we remove this coal unit, we're going to have reliability issues, especially during certain times of the year. And there's no way to fix that until a major investment or several major investments are made. So as a result, you are not allowed to retire this coal unit. That happened up in a coal unit up in, it's called Presque Isle unit up in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the utility there that wanted to retire the unit, MISO said you can't do that. There's a long story to all of that, but then there had to be a wholesale mechanism to make that unit whole, because it was determined that it was a reliability issue. It was uneconomic, but there had to be a make whole payment to make sure that the unit could continue to function until there was sufficient transmission or alternative generation in that area. So there are all types of innovative mechanisms and rules that MISO can use to make sure that there is, from a reliability perspective and from a market perspective, ample time and planning processes in place to retire these units in a way that allows for continual reliability, but it allows for a market to take place where you have more economic units coming online and you have more clean energy resources coming online to meet zero carbon goals as well.
Andrew, you're such a wealth of knowledge, and in an effort to summarize and let you go and do your day job, as important as it is, I'll try to sum up a final question for you here. So, we are basically in this very complicated picture with, a lot of times I think of it as a ship with multiple captains, right? We're not always rowing in the same direction here. You've talked about these many layers of the market. So I'm just going to set you up a question about how maybe our approach to utility regulation or our approach to policy would need to change, in some of the key strategies we might need to meet this kind of future. Because right now we have legacy generators that have provided our baseload electricity. for since we invented the grid. And those are increasingly uneconomic and increasingly unwanted because of their contribution to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have a move towards electrification. So if you look at, for example, the DOE Solar Future Study, it looks at a significant growth in electricity use as we electrify transportation and other building needs. We have the rise of technologies that provide access to solar and energy storage to a wide variety of consumers, increasing options for energy efficiency, and really outside of electrification, a decades-long trend of flat to declining potential demand. And so our current utility structure, the way that we regulate utilities, was really based on the fact that if you guarantee investors a rate of return, they'll build the generation and transmission needed to electrify, because the more access to electricity we have, the more productive we'll become and the greater our GDP. But that's decoupled, right? We've decoupled our energy use from our GDP. We're more productive with less units of electricity. And so here we sit with an incentivized model for utilities to build more things, because that's how their investors make money, when maybe we don't necessarily need them to build the things they want to build. And we know that investments in efficiency and good tariffs that incentivize peak load shaving and all this stuff, those are what's going to save us money in the future. And we need to build out all these renewable assets. If we need to build out transmission. So can we do this with the systems that we have in place? And if not, what do you see as some of the answers here to meet this future challenge?
I think we can totally meet the clean energy transition with the infrastructure we have for utility regulation in place, but we need to adapt for sure. And that's something in which utilities know that, businesses know that, Public Service Commission knows that, all the parties that participate in the utility proceedings know that. It's a matter of how and when is really big questions. There'll be disagreements as far as how we adapt. So right now, a real key investigation that the Public Service Commission has open is related to performance-based regulation. Performance-based regulation is a new concept to Wisconsin. However, it's not new to the industry in general. It's been implemented in European countries. It's been implemented in other states in the United States. So there is a basis of knowledge and experience that we can leverage. And ultimately, we need to talk about Wisconsin's unique regulatory structure, what our goals are as a society and as an individual state, and how do we adapt our regulatory structure to achieve those goals and be nimble and dynamic enough to meet future demands that we don't know how they're going to develop in a very granular level at this point, how the electrification of the transportation and building sectors will come about. And we can do our best modeling, which we help do in a zero carbon study, which I'd like to wrap up with. We can do our best modeling as possible, but no crystal ball is ever going to be 100% spot on. So we need to be able to adapt to a new environment, to new technologies that come on, to new markets that will emerge and serve these new technologies. We look at storage device. We see, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, electric storage systems being added to solar now in the state of Wisconsin. Those are mostly all lithium-ion based, but that may not be the battery storage technology that ultimately becomes the most economic 20 to 30 years from now. There may be an emerging technology that occurs that the LED of the light world that just blows out old technologies, and it's the most environmental sensitive way and resource abundant technology. So we don't know exactly what that storage device will be 20 to 30 years from now, but we need to still adapt our regulatory regime right now to be able to accommodate whatever emerging technology takes place, to allow a market that integrates utilities markets, essentially, with regards to retail services, with regards to other businesses that offer manufacturers of electric vehicles and that offer charging stations and charging services for those vehicles, that allow the incorporation of developers of solar and wind and battery storage systems and other emerging technologies that will occur. Like I said, in general, we need to adapt our regulatory regime with regards to what options are available to us through performance-based regulation. We go back to our conversation with regards to integrated resource planning, IRP. I kind of see not only an IRP through the Public Service Commission, but an interagency dialogue that will need to take place with regards to all of these emerging markets and businesses that will come to the state of Wisconsin, that will develop in the state of Wisconsin and create the economic drivers and job growth that's needed for the future in this new economy that will ultimately emerge. So you've got not only a conversation at the Public Service Commission, but at the Department of Transportation, the Department of Agriculture and Trade and Consumer Protection, the Department of Administration, which helps administrate all of these agencies, Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. All of these agencies, probably have informal dialogue right now with state officials on how do we deal with electric vehicles, how much is going to come and when. They talk with each other, and we have no formal forum that allows these officials to talk with each other, to exchange information, to make decisions that are incorporating how the industry is going to be impacted across these state agencies and their various regulatory and jurisdictional areas where they concentrate. So, and that will help inform the legislators as well as far as what legislation is going to be needed to clarify, to add market certainty, to allow this clean energy transition happen in a way that is cost effective, that's going to for sure reduce carbon emissions and create a sustainable future for the state of Wisconsin. So those are two big areas, I believe, that can help our regulatory regime adapt over the next few decades. And that, again, comes down to performance-based regulation and an IRP, or integrated resource planning process, that is interagency in its very nature, that has the ability to establish a very formal dialogue with utilities, businesses, private-public partnerships, and bring them all together to create a new market for a clean energy future.
Thank you, Andrew. That's you're singing all of our tune here. Performance-based regulation that really aligns our interests, right? Aligns the consumer interest and the business interest with the utility interest in this kind of like new opportunity and planning. I think it was Tyler Hebner, former Renew staff, I heard say, in God we trust, but everybody else bring data. And I think that when it comes to the Public Service Commission, right, we need to process that we can all, if we want to have nice things, we need a process that is transparent and open and informed and really does reflect the reality of this complex market. So I want to thank you very much for spending the time with us today, your wealth of knowledge. Any final comments from you? I know we've taken a lot of your time. Yeah,
and so we're kind of ended forward-looking as far as this clean energy transition and what all needs to take place. And a big part of that dialogue is this zero carbon study that we collaborated with Clean Wisconsin, Renew Wisconsin, and Clean Wisconsin, collaborated with other organizations to bring together the modeling and bring together the economic analysis that needs to take place. And we've put together this study, and we put it out there now. It's on our Renew website. You'll find it there. If you scroll down our homepage, it's towards the bottom of our page is the direct link to that study and all the associated documents that will help you understand the technical results of how do we get to a zero carbon future by 2050, how does it look different, what are the economic benefits of this transition, and what policies do we need to get passed before the state legislature, before the Public Service Commission, in order to make that future happen. So please reach out to me if you have any questions, and we're interested in talking with all kinds of other advocacy organizations and state agencies and utilities and businesses that want to collaborate and make this clean energy future happen. So I think it's just a great point to look at that zero carbon study and other studies that other organizations have done, and start planning together and working together on making this future happen. Andrew, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your experience, and more conversations to come.
We would like to take a moment to thank the Couliard Solar Foundation, a megawatt sponsor and longtime partner of the MREA. The Couliard Solar Foundation promotes the expansion of solar energy in Wisconsin through partnerships with renewable energy-focused, Wisconsin-based organizations. Learn more and support the cause at CoolYardSolarFoundation.org.
The Rise Up Podcast, Season 4, Episode 1, The Electric Utility Business Model. Special thanks to our guest, Andrew Kell, hosted by Nick Hyla and produced by Kyle Galloway.